From deep in the heart of West Texas, it's the Tim Kreitz Adventures Podcast. Talking motorcycles, music, beer brewing, pop culture, adventure, and all points in between. Now, here's your host, Tim Kreitz.
Time for another podcast. Hello there. How are you guys? Doing well, I sincerely hope. We are going to do something fun on today's podcast. We got really serious and analytical in the last podcast, and this time I just want to have a good time and talk about biker movies. We're officially in the dog days of summer here in the wilds of West Texas, and I'll be honest, we haven't been doing long day rides or taking any motorcycle trips really at all since the Kermit ride a couple of weeks ago due to the triple-digit heat. It's just really hot. That has given me some time to sort of revisit some of the obscure jewels buried in my rather sizable DVD collection as I sit and chill out in my nicely conditioned living room. So if you're listening to the podcast at this point in its history, chances are that you have some level of interest in motorcycles. It is Tim Kreitz Adventures. It is mostly a motorcycle channel. And it's been my experience that people who like bikes also like motorcycle movies, so I think it's a great piece of subject matter to base a podcast episode upon. I want to talk about my 5 favorite biker movies and why I think they're important, and then after that we may get into a few honorable mentions that didn't make the top 5. Now, I am basing this list on my own personal assertion that many of the best biker movies were made between about 1965 and 1975. That 10-year era melded together several different aspects of societal and artistic change that sort of collided head-on to create the motorcycle movie genre. There was all the social upheaval of the time centered around the burgeoning hippie movement and opposition to the Vietnam War. There was the generation gap. There was the sexual revolution. There was the civil rights movement. There was all this stuff going on. And in the midst of all that, there was also this very important new thing called independent film that served as the historical shell, I guess you could say, in which a lot of these shifts in attitude were ultimately preserved as art on film. Now, obviously, if you're familiar with this film genre, I don't have to tell you that these movies have a reputation, especially in historical retrospect, as being pretty darn cheesy, and they are. But what I want to do is maybe look below that delicious cheese-covered surface and delve into some of the deeper meanings so we can hopefully arrive at an understanding of some of the reasons a few of these movies have endured so well. So, think of this episode of the podcast as sort of a film study class on the cultural wake of biker pictures. The first film on the list is one that I feel pretty sure you've never heard of if you're American, even if you consider yourself a biker film buff. However, if you're from Australia and listening to this podcast, you will know this movie as absolute down-under legend. I'm talking, of course, about the 1974 Aussie motorcycle masterpiece, Stone.
Stone is a trip.
And when you're on a bike, I mean a big bike, you've got all power, man.
The gravediggers are on the move. A new breed of motorbike gang. But now, somebody wants them dead. So the cops send Stone.
He's a pig.
Yeah, that's right, I'm a cop. I've been sent to find out who's been killing your mates.
Stone is different. Take the trip.
So as you heard in the audio drop from the trailer, Stone is about an outlaw biker gang called the Gravediggers that's being assassinated one by one by this powerful organized crime group after one of the bike club members, a guy named Toad, gets too close to the killing of a politician. So the police send in Stone, who's this young, hip, undercover motorcycle riding cop, to ride with the Gravediggers to help catch the assassin and bring the organized crime group to justice. Now, this film has everything aesthetically and audiovisually that you'd expect from one of these films. It's got sexy, naked chicks, aggro outlaw bikers, fight scenes, gunplay, etc., all that stuff. But the thing that really sets this film apart for me from just about any other biker film ever made is that the Gravediggers almost all ride Kawasaki Z-bikes. It's almost entirely early 1970s Z900s, and that's an epic thing to behold in any biker film. I don't think any other biker film's ever been done like that, and it points out an interesting perspective. That is to say that in most American motorcycle films of that era, the bikers will be riding Harleys almost exclusively, with a few Triumphs thrown in here and there, that sort of thing. In British motorcycle movies, the riders will be banging around on Triumphs and BSAs and Nortons and bikes like that. But it's interesting that in the only dedicated Aussie biker movie of consequence, the riders are almost all atop Kawasaki Z-bikes. Funny thing about that is, that sort of independent attitude toward the functionality and performance of the machine, it also carries through in the overall complete nonconformist philosophies of the Gravediggers themselves. It makes for a 100% unique, almost bizarro version of the genre. I absolutely love this movie. From a cultural perspective, Stone explores the idea of the anti-hero and how good guys don't always come out on top. It's also very non-conformist, as you might imagine. Every one of the films we will discuss today are non-conformist at least, and even antisocial, like full-on antisocial. But it's uniquely Australian in how it politicizes things like the Vietnam War from their own national perspective and how it approaches sort of the Australian outlaw idea of anarchy. Very, very interesting. Also, as a side note, the guy who plays Toad in this film is a gentleman named Hugh Case Byrne, who went on a few years later to play Toe Cutter in 1979's Mad Max, and is likely the only actor in Stone most Americans will recognize. In fact, he recently returned to the Mad Max film genre, like just a few years ago, as a different villain in, I think it was Mad Max, something like Fury Road. I think it was Fury Road, Mad Max Fury Road. So that's very interesting, but I can pretty much guarantee that you've never heard of anyone else in this movie if you're outside of the land down under. All right, let's move on. The next film is the exact opposite of Stone from the perspective of being star-studded. So many people in this movie were hugely famous in their day, and among baby boomers in particular. It stars Nancy Sinatra, Bruce Dern, Diane Ladd, Peter Fonda, and a host of others. Now, also unlike Stone, this movie is a complete stinker. I mean, it's bad. But it is a movie that produced a very iconic scene that made its way into pop culture. I'm talking about the 1966 biker film, The Wild Angels.
These are the Aginners. Their emblems, those of the defeated, the despised. Their intimacies, a rape of decency. Their every enjoyment, a parody of pleasure.
My reason for listing this movie in my top 5 biker films is twofold. Firstly, this film is one of the productions that eventually led to Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda deciding to make Easy Rider, which you have probably guessed that we will be talking about a bit later. But not as my number one, I'll let you in on that much ahead of time. In short, it's about a bunch of ne'er-do-well bikers with no redeeming qualities whatsoever who go on a search for their friend's stolen motorcycle, leaving this trail of rape and beatings and mayhem in their wake. There's no misunderstood hero. There's no higher call to, social action or change or purported societal improvement. There's none of that, as are the underlying themes in so many of these movies. This one is just mayhem for its own sake and freedom abused for ill-gotten gains. But that said, it does have the inklings of that sort of preachy, holier-than-thou hippie attitude that we would see a few years later in, I guess, a more refined way in Easy Rider. You get a small taste of it in this very well-known piece of audio from Wild Angels. Have a listen.
But tell me, just what is it that you want to do?
Well, we want to be free. We want to be free to do what we want to do. We want to be free to ride. And we want to be free to ride our machines without being hassled by the man. And we want to get loaded. And we want to have a good time.
You might be saying to yourself, man, I've heard that before, but I never knew where it came from. That has been used and referenced and sampled over and over again throughout the years, all over the place throughout pop culture. That's the second reason I wanted to include this movie. As one example, those of you who grew up in the 80s and 90s might remember a band called Mudhoney. They used that audio from that scene in the intro to a track they recorded, I think in the late 80s. It was called In and Out of Grace. So how that scene has lived on in its own way, independent of the film, is really pretty interesting to me. Lastly, I would be remiss to not point out that The Wild Angels is a Roger Corman film and is most definitely wrapped up in his style, his film sensibilities. It's a Roger Corman movie. There's no doubt about it. He used real Hell's Angels in the movie and other touches like that to give the film its raw, sort of out-of-control ambience. It's worth a watch for sure. Okay, next up is a film called The Glory Stompers. It's from 1967. Much like The Wild Angels, this is one of the movies that I guess you could say led to Easy Rider, and it stars Dennis Hopper as this maniac bike club leader named Chino, who kidnaps a girl and attempts to sell her into white slavery after mistakenly thinking that he and his gang has killed her boyfriend.
This is the situation, baby. Like, we accidentally snuffed out your old man. And the only way out for me and my people is to either snuff you out or to sell you to some high-class Mexicans across the border. Now, being good people, we decided to sell you to these high-class Mexican friends of ours. But until that moment comes, baby, if you hassle us anymore, you're dead.
The noble themes, I guess you could say, in this movie are redemption, as the main protagonist in the film comes to realize that he's living the life of a loser and that there might be more meaning to life beyond pure hedonism, and also the concept of being able to blend freedom and autonomy with personal responsibility. I mean, I'm reading a lot into it at that point, but that's kind of how it speaks to me. That's something that not all of the films in this genre chose to visit. So in that sense, it is a bit different. But don't get me wrong, this is not a message picture in any way. It's ultimately a spaghetti western on motorcycles with as much obligatory violence and nudity and sexual assault and gunplay as could be gotten away with in a movie at that time. To me, it was as much about culture shock and pushing societal norms as it was about anything else. But I'll tell you that this movie's true value is in how it captures the scenery of Southern California in the mid to late 1960s, as well as the freaking awesome motorcycles you will see in this film. I mean, Dennis Hopper rides an early 1940s Knuckle. The protagonist rides a mid-50s Panhead, the sort of wise mentor character who guides the protagonist. He rides a Triumph chopper. In fact, almost all the bikes in the movie are chopped out to the max, and they're just crazy, crazy cool. In addition to that, the film's climax takes place in Death Valley at this old ghost town called Panamint City. You guys, if you watch this channel, you know I'm way into ghost towns. But the most interesting thing about this filming location is that I think it was maybe like 15 or 20 years later, after the filming of The Glory Stompers, much of the ghost town remains that you see in the film were actually destroyed by a desert flood, and they all washed away. So despite the fact that this is ultimately a cheesy biker flick, it sort of accidentally preserved a part of Death Valley's archaeological history, and that's pretty cool just in and of itself. So see this movie, especially if you are familiar with that part of Cali, you'll appreciate it, and of course especially if you're into biker films. Okay, next film. This one needs no introduction.
This year, the judges of the Cannes Film Festival presented the award Best Film by a New Director to Easy Rider. It's the story of a man who went looking for America and couldn't find it anywhere. Easy Rider stars Peter Fonda.
It's not every man that can live off the land, you know. You do your own thing in your own time. You should be proud.
Also starring Dennis Hopper, the award-winning director of Easy Rider.
Man, look, I gotta get out of here, man. We got things we want to do, man. Like, I I gotta get out of here, man.
Gosh, what can I say about Easy Rider that hasn't already been said? That's the honest challenge here. Perhaps no other independent film of the 1960s, motorcycle movie or not, has been dissected and analyzed and studied and immortalized quite like Easy Rider has. What I will throw into the film study aspect of Easy Rider from my own perspective is that, to me, this movie has always been about two guys who repeatedly did the wrong things in an effort to pursue pure hedonism, and it resulted in their untimely deaths. Actually, not only their untimely deaths, but the untimely death of a friend, Jack Nicholson's character, who they picked up along the way, who had helped them to be able to continue on their journey across America to get them from LA to New Orleans in time for Mardi Gras. So for those of you who might not know, the movie starts out with Wyatt and Billy, the two protagonists, pulling off this huge successful drug deal in order to make enough money to free them from the constraints of society so they can go do whatever they want, which is apparently little more than trying to make it to Mardi Gras in time, then continuing on to Florida and essentially retiring, as Billy puts it. My interpretation of the film is that though their fortune is ill-gotten from the start, along the way they're presented with a handful of opportunities to right that wrong and change their hedonistic course. If you pay close attention, you'll see that they're presented with the idea of self-subsistence when they stop at the Catholic farmer's ranch to fix Wyatt's flat. Here, Wyatt, he's very in tune with how meaningful it is to be able to live off the land, as he puts it, and do your own thing in your own time. It's another little phrase from the movie. Even though the land owner, doesn't really like them, he understands them and they understand him. And Wyatt gets this idea that through land ownership and good labor, you can do your own thing, but in a more productive way. But instead of exploring those possibilities further, Wyatt allows Billy to continue to influence him toward the pointless goal of making Mardi Gras. So they move on. And Billy is the devil in between the two of them. Wyatt, he's more of the angel character, the angel on the right shoulder, and Billy is the devil on the left shoulder. If you kind of look at it as you watch the movie that way, it sort of makes sense. At least it does to me that way. But even ignoring the first opportunity to change their course, they're given a second opportunity when they meet Luke Askew's character on the road and offer him a ride to his commune. Once there, they see, the commune is in need of food and money and farming implements, adequate shelter, and all that stuff. And they're even asked to stay there and live there by Askew's character. He invites them, even though he has no idea about all the money they're carrying with them hidden in the gas tanks of their bikes. But again, they refuse to do something good with their time and effort and money, even though deep down Wyatt is compelled to stay. But as before, he allows Billy's hedonistic influence to guide their way. So from that point on in the movie, you'll notice karma unleashes her wrath upon the both of them for their wrongdoing. And from that point in the movie, everything starts to go wrong. And it ultimately resolves in the film's famously tragic ending. Now, you might think that I'm reading way too much into that film, but the beautiful thing about movies is that whatever you want them to mean to you is exactly what they mean. And that's what Easy Rider means to me. To me, the lesson of Easy Rider is that there's really no true freedom or meaning without purpose and service to others. They ignore those truths and ultimately they die as a result. But what can I say? If you've never seen it, get your hands on a copy of Easy Rider and see what it means to you. Alrighty then, we have arrived at my number one most favorite biker film of all time. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the early 1950s classic, The Wild One, starring the immortal Marlon Brando.
Hey, somebody tell me what that means. BRMC. What does it mean?
Black Rebels Motorcycle Club.
Isn't that cute? Hey, Johnny, what are you rebelling against?
What do you got?
Many of you will probably know that this movie is loosely based on the infamous Hollister bike rally incident of the late 1940s. And within that context, The Wild One is an excellent zeitgeist, in my opinion, for exemplifying the mental state of some of the very young WW2 vets who came home from the war after seeing some of the most horrifying, repugnant things imaginable, and resultantly, they had a really hard time fitting back into everyday society. The country, the world, life itself wasn't the same to those guys anymore. So, they bought war surplus motorcycles, chopped and bobbed them, and then they proceeded to tear across the countryside in search of endorphins and adrenaline. Of course, those escapades led to lots of bad behavior and began to solidify the reputation of the American biker as an outlaw. In fact, the incident at Hollister, California, was the genesis for the term one percenter that we all hear used so ubiquitously these days. What I like about this movie the most, though, aside from those aspects, is that much like films such as Rebel Without a Cause, for example, The Wild One is a cultural look into 1950s angst as it was reflected in film. While it's true that the 1950s was probably the happiest and most optimistic period in American history, the seeds of cultural revolution had been planted. All the stuff that came to fruition later on in the 60s. And you can see that in this movie. You can see the inklings of, women wanted to be more than housewives, and kids wanted to do more than just follow in their parents' footsteps, that sort of thing. The whole merry-go-normal aspect of life was starting to be rejected, and The Wild One sort of encapsulates some of that. It was a much more turbulent decade than is often talked about, the 1950s, and I think there's value in The Wild One from that perspective alone. As much as for any other reason, that's a good excuse to watch the movie. It remains one of my favorite biker films of all time, and I highly, highly recommend that you give this one a watch. Okay, folks, that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast, but before I go, a couple of honorable biker movie mentions that didn't quite make the list. Check out CC & Company, as well as Angel Unchained, both from the classic biker movie era. Also, hit me up on Facebook at The Real Tim Kreitz and on Instagram at Tim Kreitz Adventures. Lots of cool stuff to see there. God bless you guys, and take care until we meet again. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. See you next time.